When Sarah Johnson heard a loud crash followed by her 8-year-old son's desperate sobs, she never imagined it would lead to the most dramatic showdown their quiet suburban neighborhood had ever witnessed. The culprit wasn't a burglar or an accident, it was Margaret Stevens, the self-appointed guardian of their HOA, standing triumphantly over Tim's mangled wheelchair in the garbage bin. What started as a simple dispute over property aesthetics spiraled into a federal crime scene when Margaret, in her infinite wisdom, decided that disabled children's mobility aids were nothing more than unsightly lawn decorations. Little did this entitled neighborhood tyrant know that her actions would introduce her to two powerful acronyms, ADA and FBI. Sarah Johnson, a single mother who had built her entire life around making the world accessible for her wheelchair-bound son, found herself face-to-face with Margaret Stevens, a woman whose rigid interpretation of HOA rules had turned her into the neighborhood's most feared resident. Tim, despite his physical limitations, had always been the brightest spot in their community until Margaret decided his wheelchair's presence on their front porch violated some imaginary aesthetic standard. As the situation escalated from passive-aggressive notes to outright theft and destruction of medical equipment, nobody anticipated that Karen's crusade against clutter would end with her in handcuffs, learning that some violations have consequences far beyond HOA fines. The Willow Creek HOA had always been known for its manicured lawns and strict adherence to community standards, but Margaret Stevens took enforcement to an entirely different level. When the Johnson family moved in 6 months ago, most neighbors welcomed them with casseroles and warm smiles, especially when they learned about little Tim's condition. The 8-year-old had been using a wheelchair since age 5, when a rare neurological condition left him unable to walk. His bright blue power chair, decorated with superhero stickers and a custom nameplate reading Tim's Turbo Wheels, had become a familiar sight in the neighborhood. Sarah had specifically chosen this house because the front entrance had a gentle ramp, making it easier for Tim to navigate between home and the specially equipped van in their driveway. She'd even checked with the HOA before purchasing, confirming that medical equipment was explicitly exempted from standard regulations. Everything seemed perfect until Margaret noticed the chair. During her self-appointed evening compliance patrols, she'd spotted Tim's wheelchair parked on the covered front porch, where it always sat overnight to keep it dry and easily accessible for morning routines. To most people, this was simply practical common sense, no different from leaving a bike or stroller in a protected area. But Margaret saw a violation. The HOA's written rules stated that no recreational vehicles or large equipment should be stored in front-facing areas, and in Margaret's rigid worldview, Tim's wheelchair fell into this category. She began her campaign subtly, leaving printed notices under the Johnsons' door at night. The first read, "Dear resident, please be advised that personal equipment must be stored out of sight from street view to maintain our community's aesthetic standards." First warning. Management. Sarah found these notes confusing since she couldn't imagine what personal equipment they were referring to. The second notice, appearing a week later, was more specific. Second warning, wheelchair visible from street. Immediate compliance required or fines will be assessed. Violations documented with photographic evidence. This time, Sarah felt a cold chill. She'd assumed the previous note was some kind of mistake or prank. With mounting anxiety, she knocked on Margaret's door, hoping to clear up what she believed must be a misunderstanding. Margaret answered, her permanently pursed lips forming an even tighter line when she saw Sarah. "I'm sorry to bother you," Sarah began politely, "but I received this notice, and I think there might be some confusion. My son Tim's wheelchair isn't recreational equipment, it's medical equipment that he needs for mobility. The HOA documents I received when we moved in specifically exempted medical devices." Margaret's eyes narrowed to slits. Rules are rules, young lady. If everyone made exceptions for their special circumstances, this neighborhood would look like a junkyard. Find somewhere else to store it, your garage, your backyard, inside your house. I don't care where, as long as it's not visible from the street. Sarah felt her face flush with indignation. It's not that simple. Tim needs quick access to his chair, especially at night for medical emergencies. Moving it to the garage means carrying a child up and down steps, and our backyard. I don't care about your excuses, Margaret interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. The rules apply to everyone equally. No exceptions. With that, she slammed the door, leaving Sarah standing on the porch, trembling with anger and disbelief. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the neighborhood. Most residents were appalled by Margaret's stance. The Jenkins family next door had already offered to help advocate for the Johnsons, and even quiet Mr. Peterson across the street muttered something about reasonable accommodations when Sarah recounted the conversation. But Margaret doubled down, claiming that making exceptions would set a dangerous precedent and that she was merely protecting everyone's property values. The third notice arrived the following Tuesday, now bearing the official HOA letterhead and Margaret's signature as compliance officer. The tone had turned threatening. Final warning: failure to comply within 48 hours will result in monetary fines of $50 per day until violation is remedied. Multiple photo documentation attached. This is your final opportunity to avoid enforcement action. The attached photos showed Tim's wheelchair from various angles, each marked with red arrows and timestamps. Sarah's hands shook as she read. She immediately called the HOA's main office, only to discover that Margaret had appointed herself to handle all compliance issues. There was no higher authority within the HOA structure to appeal to. That evening, Sarah researched federal disability laws, spending hours reading about the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act. She printed out relevant sections, highlighting passages about reasonable accommodations and discrimination based on disability status. But Margaret wasn't interested in legal nuances. When Sarah attempted another conversation, bringing the printed laws as reference materials, Margaret dismissed them with a wave of her hand. Those federal laws don't override our HOA charter, she declared, despite having no legal training whatsoever. If you don't like our rules, there's nothing stopping you from moving. This comment sparked something in Sarah. Are you seriously suggesting that a family should move rather than keep a child's medical equipment accessible? She asked, her voice rising. I'm suggesting, Margaret replied coolly, that special needs don't give anyone special rights to violate community standards. Your son's wheelchair is no different from someone leaving their golf clubs or bicycle out. Clutter is clutter. The neighbors who witnessed this exchange were stunned. Mrs. Chen, whose grandson also had special needs, later told others she had to hold back tears listening to such callousness. Things escalated further when Tim, who had been playing quietly in the yard during one of these confrontations, heard Margaret refer to his wheelchair as junk and an eyesore that brings down everyone's property values. The boy's face crumpled, and he rolled himself inside, crying. Sarah's maternal instincts kicked into overdrive. How dare you upset my child, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. He already deals with enough challenges without having to hear adults talk about his medical equipment like it's garbage. Margaret remained unmoved. Maybe this will teach you both that actions have consequences, she replied, checking something off on her ever-present clipboard. The situation reached a breaking point on a sunny Thursday afternoon. Sarah had taken Tim to his physical therapy appointment, leaving the wheelchair on its usual spot on the porch. They would be gone for approximately 2 hours, and Sarah had specifically chosen this timing because she knew Margaret had her weekly garden club meeting during this time. What she didn't know was that Margaret had intentionally changed the meeting time specifically to create this opportunity. Around 3:30 p.m., while the Johnsons were still at therapy, Margaret approached their porch. She'd armed herself with her phone camera, a printed copy of the HOA regulations, and a determination to solve this problem once and for all. Later surveillance footage from the Peterson house across the street would reveal exactly what happened next. Margaret first photographed the wheelchair from multiple angles, muttering to herself as she worked. Then, instead of leaving another note, she made a decision that would change everything. With considerable effort, she managed to lift the wheelchair, which weighed nearly 60 pounds, and carry it to the sidewalk. The footage clearly shows her struggling with the weight, at one point nearly dropping it entirely. But she persevered, dragging the chair across the lawn and down the driveway to the street's edge, where the garbage cans stood waiting for the next day's collection. With a final heave, she tipped the wheelchair over and into the large waste bin, securing the lid. She then stood back, photographed her handiwork, and actually smiled. The surveillance footage even captured her brushing off her hands in satisfaction before heading back to her own house. When Sarah and Tim returned 30 minutes later, they immediately noticed something was wrong. Tim, exhausted from therapy, needed his chair to get from the van to the house. "Mom, where's my chair?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she scanned the empty porch. She ran around the house, checking the backyard, the garage, even the neighbors' yards, thinking perhaps someone had moved it temporarily. Tim, still strapped in the van, began to cry. "Mommy, I can't get out. I need my wheels." Panic set in as Sarah realized the chair was truly missing. Just then, she heard a noise from the street, the sound of metal scraping against plastic. Following the sound, she discovered Margaret's garbage bin rocking slightly. Her blood ran cold as she lifted the lid to find Tim's wheelchair wedged inside, upside down, with several of the wheel spokes bent and the control panel damaged from the landing. "Oh my God," she whispered, then louder, "Margaret!" She shouted across the quiet street. Tim's crying intensified as he saw his damaged chair being lifted from the trash. The sight of his beloved turbo wheels broken and dirty sent him into a full meltdown. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Jenkins arrived first, taking one look at the scene and immediately calling out to Margaret, who remained conspicuously absent despite the growing crowd. Sarah's initial shock gave way to rage as she examined the damage. The custom control panel, which had cost over $2,000 and taken weeks to configure for Tim's specific needs, appeared to be completely destroyed. The bent wheels meant the chair couldn't roll properly, and the frame itself showed new scratches and dents. This wasn't just vandalism, it was the destruction of medical equipment that a child depended on for basic mobility. "Someone call the police," Sarah declared, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "This is theft and destruction of medical property." It was then that Margaret finally appeared, sauntering out of her house as if nothing were amiss. "What's all this fuss about?" she asked, though the satisfied smirk on her face suggested she knew exactly what had happened. "You destroyed my son's wheelchair," Sarah accused, pointing at the mangled equipment. "You threw it in the garbage like it was trash." Margaret's response stunned everyone present. It was cluttering up the neighborhood in violation of HOA regulations. "I gave you multiple warnings. This is what happens when residents fail to comply with community standards." The gathered neighbors exchanged incredulous looks. Mr. Peterson, the retired postal worker, stepped forward. "Margaret, that's a child's medical equipment. You can't just throw it away." Margaret's chin lifted defiantly. According to Section 4.2 of our HOA Charter, any resident can remove items that violate community standards if the owner fails to comply after proper notice. I followed protocol exactly. But Sarah had done her homework. She pulled out her phone and began reading directly from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Under federal law, discrimination against individuals with disabilities, including the removal or interference with assistive devices, is illegal. This is a civil rights violation, Margaret. Margaret scoffed. Those laws don't apply to HOA regulations. You can't use your son's condition as an excuse to break our rules. The crowd gasped at her callousness. Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "How can you be so cruel? That child needs his wheelchair. You don't just throw away someone's means of mobility." Margaret remained defiant. "If you all want to live in a neighborhood that looks like a yard sale, maybe you should move somewhere else." I'm protecting our property values. It was at this moment that Tim, still trapped in the van, managed to open the door himself. He half fell, half slid out, landing awkwardly on the ground. The sight of the 8-year-old struggling to pull himself across the driveway proved to be the final straw for everyone present. "That's it," declared Sarah, dialing 911. "This is beyond HOA rules. This is a federal crime." Margaret's confidence began to waver, but she held her ground. "You're being dramatic. It's just a wheelchair. Insurance will replace it." What Margaret failed to understand was that she had just admitted to intentionally destroying medical equipment, which several people had caught on their phones. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found a neighborhood in chaos, Tim crying on the ground near his ruined wheelchair, Sarah pacing and talking rapidly to them about disability laws, 20-some neighbors giving statements about what they'd witnessed, and Margaret standing alone, insisting that everyone was overreacting to a simple compliance issue. Officer Martinez, the responding officer, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. She had extensive training in disability rights and quickly identified multiple violations: destruction of property, potential hate crime charges, violations of the Fair Housing Act, and breaches of federal disability protection laws. Margaret's repeated assertions that she was just enforcing HOA rules and that Tim didn't deserve special treatment just because he's disabled were recorded on body cameras and would later prove instrumental in the case against her. The situation deteriorated further when Margaret, feeling cornered, made the catastrophic decision to double down on her position rather than admit any wrongdoing. "This is ridiculous," she snapped at Officer Martinez. "Since when do HOA rules not matter? That wheelchair was an eyesore, period. End of story." When the officer tried to explain the legal issues, Margaret interrupted. "Oh, so now we're supposed to treat disabled kids like they're special? What's next? Letting them park their equipment anywhere they want, make noise at all hours, have therapy sessions that disturb the peace?" The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, you just admitted to deliberately destroying medical equipment belonging to a minor with disabilities. These are federal charges we're talking about." But Margaret wasn't finished. Everyone's so quick to play the disability card these days. Back in my day, people with problems stayed at home and didn't impose on their neighbors. Maybe if this family can't conform to normal standards, they shouldn't live in a normal neighborhood. The crowd erupted in angry protests, but Margaret continued her tirade. "I've lived here for 15 years, and I've never seen such a decline in standards. First it's wheelchairs on porches, then it'll be ramps everywhere, special parking spots, noise from medical equipment. Where does it end?" Each word Margaret spoke was being recorded, not just by police body cameras but by multiple neighbors on their phones. Her complete lack of awareness about the legal implications of her statements would later astound prosecutors. Officer Martinez made the decision to place Margaret under arrest for destruction of property and civil rights violations. As she was being read her Miranda rights, Margaret's face finally showed the first signs of panic. "Wait, you can't arrest me. I'm the HOA compliance officer. I have authority here." The officer patiently explained that no HOA rules supersede federal civil rights laws, particularly those protecting people with disabilities. "But I have photos," Margaret insisted, waving her phone. "Photos that prove I gave them fair warning. I documented everything properly." What she failed to realize was that her meticulous documentation would actually work against her in court, providing a clear timeline of harassment and discrimination. As Margaret was led to the police car, she continued protesting. "This is insane. I'm being arrested for enforcing neighborhood standards. Where's the justice in that?" Officer Martinez responded calmly, "The justice is in protecting the rights of all residents, including those with disabilities, to live with dignity and access to necessary medical equipment." The arresting charges included willful destruction of medical property, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, harassment, and discrimination based on disability status, federal felony charges that carried significant penalties. As the police car drove away with Margaret inside, the neighborhood was left to process what had just unfolded. The Jenkins family immediately invited Sarah and Tim to stay with them while they figured out arrangements for a new wheelchair. Mr. Peterson, who had remained largely quiet during the confrontation, approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry this happened to your family," he said. "Some of us tried to talk to her before, but she's been impossible to reason with for years." It turned out that Margaret's behavior had been escalating for some time, but this was the first incident serious enough to involve law enforcement. Other neighbors shared stories of HOA overreach, though none quite as egregious as the wheelchair incident. Mrs. Chen mentioned that Margaret had once tried to force her to remove a wheelchair ramp from her own home, claiming it was unsightly and lowered property values. As news of Margaret's arrest spread through the neighborhood and beyond, the incident became a cautionary tale about the intersection of HOA authority and federal disability laws. Legal experts would later explain that while HOAs have broad authority to regulate community standards, that authority is explicitly limited by federal civil rights laws, particularly those protecting people with disabilities. The Department of Justice would eventually use this case as a training example for HOA boards nationwide, emphasizing that no community regulations can override federal protections for disabled individuals. For Tim and Sarah, the immediate aftermath was challenging. Tim's injuries from his fall were minor, but the psychological impact was significant. He had heard every word Margaret said about him and his wheelchair, and it would take months of therapy to help him process the experience. The damaged wheelchair needed extensive repairs that took weeks to complete, during which time Tim had to use a borrowed hospital-style chair that didn't fit his specific needs. The community rallied around the Johnson family, but the incident had shattered the sense of safety they'd felt in their new neighborhood. Margaret, meanwhile, faced a legal reckoning that went far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The federal charges meant she couldn't simply pay a fine and move on. Her actions had triggered multiple laws designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society, and prosecutors were determined to make an example of her case. The extensive documentation she had created, thinking it would protect her, instead provided a clear timeline of discrimination and harassment. Her own words, recorded on police body cameras and neighbors' phones, formed an irrefutable record of her intent to discriminate based on disability. The HOA board, horrified by the legal implications of Margaret's actions, immediately removed her from all positions of authority and issued a formal apology to the Johnson family. They also implemented new training requirements for all board members and officers regarding federal disability laws and reasonable accommodations. What had started as a simple dispute over storing a wheelchair had exposed deep-seated prejudices and ignorance about disability rights that would take the community years to fully address and overcome. The incident served as a stark reminder that federal protections for disabled individuals exist precisely because people like Margaret still harbor outdated and discriminatory views about what constitutes normal in their communities. The courtroom was packed on the day of Margaret's arraignment, with local news outlets covering what had become known as the Wheelchair's Rights case. Judge Patricia Williams, known for her strict interpretation of disability law, presided over the initial hearing. As Margaret stood before the bench, her former confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a pale-faced realization of the enormity of her situation. Her attorney, a hastily hired civil rights defense lawyer who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the charges were read, attempted to downplay the situation as a neighborhood dispute that got out of hand. The prosecutor, however, had no intention of letting this case be minimized. Assistant District Attorney James Chen methodically presented each charge: felony destruction of medical property, multiple counts of civil rights violations under the ADA, criminal harassment of a minor, and federal discrimination charges. Each count carried significant penalties, with potential prison time ranging from 6 months to 5 years per charge. The evidence against Margaret was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the timeline of harassment through her own documented notices, the surveillance footage showing her deliberately throwing Tim's wheelchair into the garbage, recorded statements from 23 neighbors, police body camera footage, and most damning of all, Margaret's own recorded words where she explicitly stated that disabled children should stay home rather than impose on normal neighborhoods. Legal experts attending the hearing noted that Margaret had essentially created a textbook case of disability discrimination, complete with a paper trail that would be studied in law schools for years to come. When asked how she pleaded, Margaret's attorney entered a plea of not guilty, though he privately advised her that a plea deal might be her best option given the mountain of evidence. The case caught national attention, with disability rights advocates from across the country reaching out to support the Johnson family. The National Council on Independent Living issued a statement calling the case a stark reminder of why federal disability protections remain essential in our communities. Major news networks picked up the story, with CNN running a segment titled "When HOA Power Goes Too Far" and Fox News debating the limits of community association authority versus federal disability rights. Social media exploded with the hashtag #WheelchairRights, with thousands sharing their own stories of discrimination and accessibility challenges. Margaret, who had previously reveled in attention as her neighborhood's self-appointed authority figure, now found herself infamous as the face of modern disability discrimination. During the weeks leading up to trial, more details emerged about Margaret's pattern of behavior. Former residents of the HOA came forward with additional complaints, revealing that this wasn't an isolated incident. A family with an autistic child had been harassed for installing a sensory-friendly garden that Margaret deemed unconventional. An elderly man with mobility issues had been forced to remove a handrail from his front steps because it wasn't pre-approved by the Architectural Committee, a committee that consisted solely of Margaret. A disabled veteran had moved away after Margaret's constant harassment about his service dog's presence in common areas. The prosecution added these testimonies to their case, painting a picture of systemic discrimination that went far beyond a single incident. Tim's recovery became a central focus of media coverage. Child psychologists interviewed for news stories explained the profound impact such experiences could have on a disabled child's sense of belonging and self-worth. Tim had begun having nightmares about people taking his wheelchair away, and his previously outgoing personality had become more reserved. Sarah, thrust into an unwanted spotlight, used her platform to advocate for stronger protections for disabled children and clearer guidelines for HOA compliance with federal disability laws. She testified before a congressional subcommittee on housing and disability rights, where she eloquently explained how a simple accommodation had become a federal case because of one person's prejudice and abuse of authority. The trial, when it finally began 4 months later, proved to be a landmark case in disability law. Margaret's defense team attempted various strategies, from claiming she was unaware of disability laws to arguing that she believed the wheelchair was merely recreational equipment. However, each attempt was systematically dismantled by the prosecution. The body of evidence was too comprehensive, and Margaret's own documented words and actions painted an undeniable picture of deliberate discrimination. The defense's most desperate argument, that HOA authorities somehow superseded federal disability protections, was quickly dismissed by Judge Williams, who noted that such reasoning represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how federal law operates. During witness testimony, particularly when Tim took the stand with his parents' permission, the courtroom atmosphere became emotionally charged. Tim, now 9 years old and articulate beyond his years, described how losing access to his wheelchair made him feel like I wasn't important and how Margaret's words about disabled children staying home had haunted him. He spoke about the physical pain of trying to navigate without his proper equipment and the emotional pain of being treated as less than human. When the prosecutor asked him what he learned from this experience, Tim's response went viral. I learned that some grown-ups can be mean to kids just for being different, but I also learned that there are laws to protect people like me, and lots of people who think those laws are important. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The swift decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Margaret's violations. During sentencing, Judge Williams delivered a scathing condemnation of Margaret's actions and the dangerous precedent her behavior represented. This case exemplifies why federal disability protections exist and must be vigorously enforced, she stated. The defendant's actions were not merely violations of HOA protocol gone wrong, but deliberate, sustained discrimination against a disabled child and his family. Such behavior strikes at the heart of what we mean by equal access and human dignity. Margaret was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, significant fines totaling $127,000, which would go toward disability rights organizations, and mandatory completion of 200 hours of community service specifically working with disabled individuals. Additionally, she was permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position anywhere in the United States. The sentence sent shockwaves through HOA communities nationwide, with many boards immediately reviewing their policies and procedures to ensure compliance with federal disability laws. The case established important legal precedents about the limits of HOA authority and the absolute nature of federal disability protections. The civil suit that followed the criminal trial resulted in additional consequences for Margaret. The Johnson family, represented by a team of pro bono disability rights attorneys, successfully sued not only Margaret but also the HOA itself for failing to prevent discrimination. The settlement included full replacement of Tim's wheelchair, coverage of all medical and psychological treatment costs, and a substantial damages award. More importantly, the HOA was required to implement comprehensive disability rights training for all board members and establish an ombudsman position specifically for disability-related concerns. The settlement also included provisions for installing accessibility features throughout the community, including curb cuts, accessible parking spaces, and barrier-free pathways improvements that benefited multiple residents with disabilities. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond one neighborhood. The Department of Housing and Urban Development used the case to develop new guidelines for HOA compliance with disability laws, distributing educational materials to thousands of community associations nationwide. Law schools incorporated the case into their civil rights curricula, using it to illustrate how federal protections intersect with local governance. Disability rights organizations cited it as a victory in their ongoing efforts to ensure equal access and accommodation in residential communities. Most significantly, the case inspired other victims of HOA discrimination to come forward, leading to a wave of similar cases being filed across the country. For Tim and Sarah, the resolution brought both relief and ongoing challenges. While the legal victory provided validation and resources, Tim continued to struggle with the psychological aftermath of the experience. He underwent therapy to address his trauma, slowly rebuilding his confidence and sense of security. The family chose to remain in their home, feeling that leaving would send the wrong message and potentially impact ongoing legal protections for other disabled residents. They became advocates for disability rights, with Sarah serving on advisory boards for several housing accessibility organizations and Tim speaking at schools about inclusion and acceptance. Margaret's imprisonment and subsequent community service would prove to be transformative, though in ways no one anticipated. Working directly with disabled individuals as part of her sentence, she was forced to confront the humanity and dignity of the people she had so casually dismissed. While some disabilities advocates criticized the rehabilitation through exposure approach, others noted that Margaret's eventual public apology and advocacy work following her release demonstrated the possibility for genuine change, albeit after significant consequences. Her former neighborhood, meanwhile, had fundamentally shifted its culture around disability inclusion, with new leadership implementing policies that went beyond mere legal compliance to actively promote accessibility and inclusion. The case's legacy continued to ripple through legal and social systems. Federal agencies used it as a benchmark for enforcement actions, while disability rights organizations held it up as an example of successful advocacy through legal channels. Community associations nationwide revised their bylaws and training programs, recognizing that ignorance of federal disability laws was no longer an acceptable excuse. The wheelchair rights case became part of a larger conversation about power, privilege, and the rights of disabled individuals to full participation in their communities. Looking back 5 years later, Tim, now a confident teenager, reflected on the experience during a documentary interview. "What happened to me was really hard, but it helped change things for lots of other kids. Now when I see HOA rules, they usually mention disability rights right up front. People understand better that accessibility isn't special treatment, it's just making sure everyone can live their life." His mother Sarah added, "We never wanted to be the face of a federal case, but I'm glad our experience helped protect other families. No child should ever have to watch their mobility equipment get thrown in the garbage by someone who thinks they're somehow less deserving of respect." The community itself had transformed significantly. The HOA implemented some of the most progressive accessibility policies in the state, including stipulating that all modifications requested for disability purposes would be automatically approved unless they posed legitimate safety concerns. They established a fund to help residents with disabilities make necessary home modifications and created a mentorship program pairing new families with disabled members with long-term residents who could help navigate community resources. Most tellingly, the neighborhood became known in the region as exceptionally welcoming to disabled residents, with real estate agents specifically marketing it as a model of inclusive community design. Margaret's story continued in unexpected directions. Upon her release from prison, she wrote a book titled Learning to See: My Journey from Prejudice to Understanding, with all proceeds going to disability rights organizations. In interviews, she was candid about her transformation. "I thought I was protecting property values, but I was really protecting my own narrow worldview. Working with disabled individuals during my sentence showed me how much I had to learn. Their struggles and triumphs aren't burdens on a community, they're reminders of our shared humanity." Some in the disability community remain skeptical of her conversion, viewing it as part of her legal rehabilitation rather than genuine growth. However, her consistent advocacy work and financial contributions to accessibility causes gradually earned her a measure of acceptance, if not forgiveness. The legal precedents set by the case continued to influence disability law at the national level. Congress referenced it during hearings about strengthening the ADA, and several states passed specific legislation clarifying that HOA rules could never supersede federal disability protections. The case also inspired technology companies to develop better tools for documenting accessibility violations, leading to mobile apps that could quickly identify ADA compliance issues in residential communities. These technological advances, combined with increased legal awareness, created a new era of proactive accessibility advocacy. Perhaps the most profound change occurred in how communities discussed disability and accommodation. The case sparked honest conversations about ableism, privilege, and the often invisible barriers faced by disabled individuals in everyday settings. Schools incorporated lessons about disability rights into their civics curricula, using Tim's story as an age-appropriate example of how laws protect everyone's right to equal access. Community organizations hosted workshops about inclusive design and reasonable accommodations, moving beyond mere legal compliance toward genuine understanding and acceptance. Tim's journey became emblematic of a generation of disabled youth who refused to be defined by others' limitations or prejudices. His testimony during the trial, where he articulated his needs and rights with remarkable clarity, inspired other young disabled advocates. He later spoke at the United Nations on World Disability Day, emphasizing that accessibility benefits everyone. "When my neighborhood made changes for people like me, parents with strollers could move around better too. When buildings have ramps, delivery workers don't have to struggle with steps. Making things accessible makes things better for everyone." The ripple effects of the case extended into unexpected areas. Architecture schools began teaching universal design principles with greater emphasis, using the Johnson neighborhood as a case study in both what not to do and how communities can transform. Local governments established stronger oversight of HOA compliance with federal laws, with some creating dedicated ombudsman offices for disability-related housing concerns. Real estate professionals received enhanced training about fair housing laws and disability accommodations, ensuring they could better serve all potential homeowners. Years later, when journalists revisited the story for anniversary features, they found a neighborhood transformed. The same streets where Margaret had once patrolled for violations now featured children of all abilities playing together, with accessible playground equipment and smooth pathways connecting homes. Tim's wheelchair, once considered an eyesore, had inspired a community-wide commitment to universal design that made the neighborhood a model for inclusive residential planning. The story that began with one person's prejudice and abuse of power had evolved into a testament to the possibility of systemic change when laws, community values, and individual courage align to protect the rights and dignity of all residents.